having some technical difficulties. My main computer went down on me. Before I start, I just want to give some condolences for the people who passed from COVID. Still going through this same thing. Somebody had a question for me, so I'm going to go ahead and address that right now. They said, "Hi Bruce, would you please consider doing a video on the assessor's point of view? That would be a great help." Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. Then if there's anybody who has any open line of questions, like any questions, we'll address that. All right, so the question was, what is the assessor's point of view? So the first thing we need to talk about is, what is an assessor? So an assessor is an individual, a organization, a unit who does assessments. In this case, we're talking about information system security assessments, cybersecurity assessments, information assurance assessments. So there's lots of different names for it, and there's actually many different kinds of assessments. But what you're doing basically is you're looking at an organization's current behavior, current configuration, current settings, and then you're comparing that to laws, policy, regulations. That's pretty much all you're doing, is that you're comparing those two things. An assessor goes out, step one, meets with a team, coordinates with the team. Step two, they actually do their assessment. That means they gather data. And then step three is they analyze it. So in a nutshell, that's what an assessor does. But the main types of assessors, I would say, is somebody who's doing a self-assessment, an internal assessor, and an external assessor. And the differences between those is that a self-assessment is basically you. And the problem with a self-assessment is that there's bias, because if you're assessing your own system or your own process, of course you're going to be, you're too close to the problem, so you're going to have some level of bias. So an internal assessment from their perspective is they're looking at the whole organization. They're saying, okay, they're representing the whole organization, and it might be, let's say it's a Department of Federal Lands, right? I just made that up. Department of Federal Lands has one team that does assessments, and that team is within the organization, so it's an internal assessment. So their perspective is they're looking at, okay, what can I gather as far as the whole organization? Because they're hitting each unit. They're going to hit the HR department, they're going to hit the IT department, they're going to hit a department that has an alternate site. They're hitting different organizations, so they're seeing the big picture. Unlike a self-assessor who is just looking at stuff that you might have actually helped implement those actual controls. So you have a bias, you have kind of a conflict of interest, because you might have interpreted things wrong, and you might have your bias might force you to kind of overlook things or maybe even hide things. But an internal assessor, they're looking at, here's our organization. What am I looking at when I go to HR? What am I going at when I go to the IT department? What am I looking at when I go to the alternate site? They're looking at all of those things. And so they're looking at it from a scheduling perspective, right? They don't have, they're not as interested in you passing or failing. So, I mean, of course, they probably hope you fail, because they're looking at all things within the organization. However, they're more objective because they have to look at maybe 15 or 16 different sites, and they have to gather data from those 16 sites. The first thing that they're doing is they're creating a schedule. They have to do something called a security assessment plan or a privacy assessment plan. And what they do with that is make a document where they're identifying the scope of what they're actually going to scan, or the scope of who they're going to interview, or what they actually are going to cover. It may be technical, where they're actually performing scans. It may be procedural, where they're actually interviewing people and making sure you have appropriate documents. It just depends. There's many different kinds. But an internal assessor, they're looking at, one of the things that happens with them is that a lot of their time is focused on the problem children. Like, there's going to be some units that have more issues, or it's going to take them way longer to do this one particular scan or do this one particular set of interviews that they have to do. And so in their privacy assessment plan or their security assessment plan, they've got to schedule out when they're going to come there, who they're going to meet, what they're going to cover, and when. So that is their perspective, right? So the last one is the external assessment. The external assessor, their perspective is completely objective because this is an outside object. They don't have any affiliation with your organization. They are outside of your organization. They work for either an upper level organization or they work for a third party private organization that's been brought in to assess your situation. So they're looking at it, their perspective is that of gathering data. That's all they're doing. They're going to have an evidence-based approach to actually doing all the assessment activities. So it's the coldest, most objective thing that you can get, and it's really the top of the food chain when it comes to an actual very clean assessment, because there's no bias. There's no, if they're good, they're not going to have any bias. But what I want to point you at is the actual documentations that you can use if you are an assessor, if you're going into it, or if you want to read about it, know more about it. Because at some point, if you do information system security work, you will be doing some sort of assessment. So this document kind of talks about types of assessments and then what you do in those assessments. It's pretty in the weeds because, as you can see, it's talking about assessor scans, pen testing, cracking passwords, stuff like that. So this is the 800-115 Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment. Another document that I think is even more useful and it's more broad is 800-53A, and this is Assessing Security and Privacy Controls in Federal Information Systems. So this one, what it does is it talks about each control. How do you assess each individual control? And I'll just give you an example of what I mean by each individual control. Let me see. We'll just dive into this. And one of these days, I think what I'll do is break this down a little bit further. I was thinking about making a whole course about assessments. But let's see, AC3, which is access enforcement. And what's the objective of this assessment? You're determining if the information system enforces the approved authorization for logical access to the information system and the resources. So basically what you're doing is you're looking at the policies that are written by the organization, and you're determining if the systems that they have in place can actually implement access enforcement. Like, can it stop this person from having certain privileges to this certain file? Is it checking for it doesn't have different users, does it have role-based users, things like that, role-based access, I mean. So what are you doing to if you're the assessor, what are you doing to validate this objective? You can do several things here, and it says potential assessment methods, and it has this for every. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. It has this for each individual control. So you, as the assessor, you're selecting from. See, it says select from. When you're examining, you're going to select from these documents: an access control policy, a procedure addressing access enforcement. And you're looking at these documents and you're saying, okay, do they have what's in their document? Does this reflect what they're actually doing? And then all you're doing is gathering information. That's all you're doing. That is the perspective of an assessor. And then another thing you can do is interview. That's going to the organizational personnel and actually asking them the questions. Do you guys actually have access enforcement? Simple as that. And then you're documenting it. Then you can test it. You can actually go to an actual server, have someone log in and see what happens. Like, can you access this file? Can you access that? You're trying to see if a normal user can access something that's normally should be reserved for a privileged user, and you're trying to see if a privileged user has too much privileges. So that's what you're doing as an assessor. Those are the two documents that you can use as an assessor. And since this one is so late, I'm going to go ahead and stop this one. I will definitely next week do this a little bit earlier. But appreciate the question. Definitely appreciate the question. And if you have if any of you guys have any questions at all, it's something you want me to cover as far as a video, I'll definitely do it. Just let me know. You can let me know in the comments. You can sign up for my combo courses, and I got free courses. You can actually just send me messages directly inside of the course, and I'll see those messages and I'll